The cold Atlantic wind carried the scent of salt and steel that morning. June 6, 1944. The world called it D-Day, but for the men crammed into landing craft off the coast of Normandy, it was something else entirely. It was the moment history stopped being written in offices and began being written in blood. Thousands of soldiers looked toward a horizon obscured by smoke and gunfire. Amid them was a young medic, Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr., a man the world would almost forget, yet one whose courage would redefine what heroism truly meant. As the assault craft rocked violently in the surf, shrapnel tore through its hull. Metal screamed, men shouted, blood mixed with seawater. In that chaos, Woodson himself was hit, fragments ripping into his leg and back. He was bleeding, stunned, and gasping. But even before the craft's ramp dropped, his training, his instinct, and his duty had already taken command. When the door opened, hell broke loose. The men of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, one of the few African-American units to land on D-Day, stepped into history's deadliest crossfire. The sand exploded under machine gun fire. Mortar shells ripped through the beach. The wounded screamed for medics who never came. Woodson did. Ignoring his own injuries, he crawled through the rising tide, dragging his medical bag behind him. Around him, men were drowning under their own gear or cut down before reaching dry sand. Woodson reached the first man he saw, his leg shredded by gunfire. Without hesitation, he tore open a morphine syringe, stopped the bleeding, and moved on. Then another. For the next 30 hours, Woodson worked, not as a black soldier or a white soldier, not as a hero seeking glory, but as a human being, saving other human beings. He set broken limbs, bandaged wounds, and pulled men from the surf, often while under direct fire. He performed amputations with trembling hands, his own blood dripping onto the sand. No cameras recorded him. No journalists wrote his name. History, at least for a time, looked away. But on that beach, under a gray sky and relentless gunfire, Waverly Woodson carried out more acts of courage in a single day than most men perform in a lifetime. He saved more than 200 soldiers before collapsing from exhaustion and blood loss. And when medics finally ordered him to rest, his first request was to go back to work. The beach at Omaha was supposed to be a slaughterhouse. For many, it was. But for the men who survived, many owed their lives to a medic who refused to stop fighting, not with a weapon, but with compassion. History often tells the story of generals and victories, of flags raised and strategies drawn. Yet sometimes, the truest story lies in the quiet defiance of one man, kneeling in the sand, holding his hand over a wound that will not stop bleeding, both his own and someone else's. Waverly Woodson's story did not fit neatly into the narrative of wartime glory. He didn't lead charges or capture fortifications. He didn't plant a flag. But he did something rarer. He saved lives when everything around him was built to destroy them. And yet, after the war, his name faded into obscurity. The record books barely mentioned him. The medal he was recommended for, the Medal of Honor, never came. In 1944 America, recognition had color. Valor had conditions. The U.S. Army recognized Woodson's bravery with the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart, but not the nation's highest honor. His commanding officers described his actions as extraordinary gallantry. A report was filed recommending him for the Medal of Honor, but somewhere between the chaos of war and the quiet prejudice of paperwork, that recommendation vanished. Still, Woodson never complained. He returned home, continued his education, built a life, and carried his memories in silence. He never sought the spotlight, nor bitterness. The war for him had already revealed the truth of what mattered: duty, compassion, and service. But history has a way of circling back to unfinished stories. Decades later, historians uncovered his records, eyewitness reports, and military citations. They found testimony from men who said plainly, "That medic saved my life." They began to piece together what had been forgotten. That one African-American medic on Omaha Beach performed acts of heroism equal to any ever recorded in the war. And with that rediscovery came a question America could no longer ignore. If courage has no color, why did recognition? As efforts to honor Woodson's memory gained momentum, so too did the movement to acknowledge the thousands of black soldiers who fought, bled, and died in a segregated army. An army that, even in the midst of global war for freedom, often denied them their own. Their story is not one of bitterness, but of triumph, of men who proved through action that patriotism cannot be limited by prejudice. And at the center of that story stands a medic who saw beyond race, beyond rank, beyond fear. Waverly Woodson didn't just save lives, he preserved something greater: the idea that in humanity's darkest moments, compassion is its brightest light. The guns of Normandy eventually fell silent, but the echoes of that day would last for generations. For the men who fought there, the war never truly ended. It followed them home, in memories, in scars, in the sound of waves crashing against the shore at night. For Waverly Woodson, those echoes were quieter, but no less haunting. He carried the war inside him, not the trauma of what he had done, but the weight of what he had seen, the faces of men he couldn't save, the blood that never seemed to wash off. Yet through it all, he remained gentle. Those who knew him after the war said he spoke rarely about Omaha Beach, and when he did, it was never about himself. It was always about the men who had fought beside him, about their courage and their suffering. He told stories of their humanity, never his heroism. The U.S. Army, meanwhile, moved forward. The headlines celebrated victory, medals were pinned, parades were held, the narrative of triumph took shape, a story of unity, sacrifice, and the righteousness of the Allied cause. But buried beneath that story was another truth, that thousands of black soldiers had fought for a freedom they did not yet fully possess. At the time of D-Day, the U.S. military remained segregated by law. Black troops served in separate units, often relegated to support roles, truck drivers, stevedores, or labor battalions. Many were denied the chance to fight, not because they lacked skill or courage, but because of the color of their skin. And yet, when the moment came, they fought anyway. On the beaches of Normandy, under the same fire, in the same sand, with the same fear. They bled red, just like everyone else. Waverly Woodson's unit, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, was one of the few African-American combat units to take part in the invasion. Their mission was to deploy barrage balloons to protect the landing forces from enemy aircraft. But when the assault went wrong, they became infantry, medics, and rescuers. They adapted. They survived. They made history, quietly, efficiently, heroically. After the war, most of them went home uncelebrated. Some could not find work. Some were denied benefits. Many faced the same discrimination they had left behind when they enlisted. Yet despite everything, they had proven something fundamental, that patriotism is not defined by recognition, but by sacrifice. Waverly Woodson embodied that truth. For decades, His story slept in military archives, buried under layers of forgotten paperwork. His widow, Joanne Woodson, would spend the next half-century fighting to bring it back into the light. She wrote letters to Congress. She spoke to journalists. She told her husband's story again and again, not to seek glory, but to correct a wrong that had gone unanswered for far too long. Eventually, her efforts reached historians and senators. Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland took up the cause, submitting legislation to posthumously award Woodson the Medal of Honor. It was not an easy process. Military bureaucracy moved slowly, especially when dealing with history. But as new evidence surfaced, as witnesses' accounts were rediscovered, the picture became clearer. This was not a man who performed one or two brave acts. This was a man who carried out an unbroken chain of heroism for over 30 hours, wounded, exhausted, and unarmed. A man who turned a beach of chaos into a field hospital. Historians revisited the testimonies of those he saved. One recalled being pulled from the surf, half conscious, seeing a medic's face above him. He never knew his name, only that he lived because of him. Another described how Woodson used his bare hands to remove shrapnel and patch wounds with what little supplies he had left. There were no sterile instruments, no anesthesia, no rest, only willpower and compassion. When a man like that is forgotten, it's not just an individual injustice. It's a failure of collective memory. Because history isn't only written in the battles we win. It's written in the moments we choose to remember. In the 1990s, military scholars began re-examining the role of African American soldiers in World War II. They found patterns, missing citations, incomplete reports, recommendations that vanished without explanation. Dozens of cases emerged where acts of valor had been overlooked or dismissed. Waverly Woodson's story stood out among them. Not because it was the only example, but because it was so thoroughly documented and yet still ignored. As one historian wrote, if Waverly Woodson had been white, he would have been a household name. It's a sentence that cuts deep, not just because it's true, but because it forces us to confront what kind of nation we were and what kind we strive to be. Yet through it all, Woodson's legacy never depended on medals or recognition. It lived in the men he saved, in the lives he touched, and in the quiet dignity with which he carried himself after the war. He became a symbol, not of bitterness, but of perseverance, of a man who did what was right because it was right, not because history would remember him for it. And in that, perhaps, lies the greatest measure of heroism. Woodson once said in an interview years later, when asked about the war, "I was just doing my job." But history would eventually reveal that his job was nothing short of extraordinary. He fought the same battle twice, once on the beaches of Normandy and again in the halls of history, to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be remembered. That fight, in many ways, continues to this day. In the decades that followed, the memory of World War II transformed. What had once been a living story of veterans and eyewitnesses became history, recorded, analyzed, and passed down. But some stories never made it into the textbooks. They survived instead through family memories, old letters, and quiet conversations in kitchens and community halls. Waverly Woodson's story was one of those. A story kept alive by love, by his widow Joanne, by historians who refused to give up, and by a new generation determined to fill in the blanks of the past. The war had ended, but its consequences stretched across lifetimes. For every medal awarded, there were countless acts of courage that went unseen. For every name remembered, there were others left behind. Yet history has a way of correcting itself, if we let it. In recent years, the U.S. military and Congress have re-examined cases like Woodson's, acknowledging what earlier generations overlooked. The process has been long and difficult, but it reflects something essential about America: the belief that it's never too late to do the right thing. When Senator Chris Van Hollen said, "It is never too late to right a historic wrong," he wasn't just speaking about a medal. He was speaking about the integrity of memory itself, about the responsibility we share to tell the truth, not just the convenient truth, but the whole one. Because when we choose to honor someone like Waverly Woodson, we are also honoring every man and woman who served quietly, without fanfare, whose names may never be spoken in documentaries or engraved in marble, but whose sacrifices built the foundation of the freedom we live under today. The beaches of Normandy are quiet now. The tides come and go, washing over the same sand that once ran red with blood. The concrete bunkers still stand, softened by moss and time. Tourists walk where men once crawled. Children play where soldiers died. And somewhere in that silence, the echoes of that June morning remain. If you stand there long enough, you can almost hear it: the distant thunder of artillery, the cries for medics, the sound of courage in the face of chaos. It's in that moment you realize that history isn't just about the past. It's about the choices we make now, to remember, to learn, to become better. Waverly Woodson didn't fight for recognition. He fought to save lives. And in doing so, he gave us a lesson far greater than valor, the lesson of humanity itself. He proved that heroism isn't defined by race or rank or reward. It's defined by action, by what you do when everything around you is falling apart, and you still choose to stand up and help another person. That's the kind of courage that transcends medals, the kind that outlives wars. As the years go on, historians continue to push for the Medal of Honor, not as a symbol of glory, but as a symbol of truth. Because the measure of a nation lies not in its victories, but in how it honors those who made them possible. Joanne Woodson is now in her late 90s. When asked why she continues the fight, she says simply, "Because he deserves it." And she's right. He deserves it, not just for what he did on D-Day, but for what he represented. In his strength, there was compassion. In his suffering, there was purpose. And in his silence, there was dignity. That is what makes his story timeless. Even now, 80 years later, his legacy continues to ripple outward, inspiring soldiers, students, and ordinary citizens to believe that courage and conscience can coexist. History may have forgotten him once, but not anymore. Because the story of Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. reminds us of something every generation must relearn: that true greatness lies not in recognition, but in doing what is right, even when no one is watching. He was a medic, a soldier, a husband, and above all, a human being who refused to let hate or pain dictate his actions. And that is the kind of legacy that never fades. In the end, stories like Waverly Woodson's remind us that history is not only about nations, but about people, individuals who stood their ground when the world was falling apart. Their courage, their integrity, and their quiet humanity are what define the true legacy of the Second World War. So if this story moved you, if it made you think, remember, or simply feel proud of those who came before us, then stay connected with us. There are still so many untold stories waiting to be brought to light. Subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering the hidden chapters of history. Stories of forgotten heroes, decisive moments, and the human spirit that refused to break. And before you go, don't miss the next chapter in our series. Watch the video on your screen now for another powerful World War II documentary filled with truth, depth, and cinematic storytelling. Because history deserves to be remembered, completely, honestly, and with the respect it's earned.